Right, welcome everybody. So you've got quite a long session now of good clinical practice. It's quite a dry subject. Apologies for that, I can't excuse that. But I'll try and make it as interesting as possible. We've got a couple of exercises to keep everyone awake, and there'll be some questions throughout the presentation, just to make sure that you've been listening. Right. So to facilitate getting a certificate at the end of it, has everybody added their initials? Thank you. Right. So what is GCP? So GCP is an international ethical scientific quality standard for designing, conducting, recording and reporting trials that involve the participation of human subjects. Its objectives were to provide a unified standard across the US, European Union, Japan, and now across the world, to facilitate the mutual acceptance of clinical data by the regulatory authorities in these jurisdictions. So it's so that data can be trusted, so that trials do not have to be repeated and risk exposure of extra participants to any risks that the trial carried. And obviously that also saves money. There are 13 principles of GCP, and the ones that are highlighted in red are those that have received the most changes with the new Revision 2 guidelines, which were published in November 2016. So responsibility is split three ways throughout ICH GCP. So Chapter 3 of the GCP guidelines concerns the Research Ethics Committee, or the Review Board. It's an independent body constituted of medical professionals, non-medical members, whose responsibility it is to ensure the protection of the rights, safety and well-being of human subjects involved in a trial and to provide public assurance of that protection. Chapter 4 of the guidelines concerns the investigator, which is a person responsible for the conduct of the clinical trial at a trial site. If a trial is conducted by a team of individuals, the investigator is the responsible leader. Thanks. Didn't want to echo. So the investigator is a responsible leader of a team and may be called the principal investigator. Chapter 5 concerns the sponsor, who can be an individual, a company, an institution or an organisation which takes the responsibility for the initiation, management and or financing of a clinical trial. And throughout this talk, the blue highlighted stuff is going to reference in the ICH GCP guidelines where you can actually find that. And Chapter 1 is the glossary, and these have been taken from the definitions throughout the guidelines. So what is a clinical trial? So it's an investigation in human subjects intended to discover or verify the clinical, pharmacological and or pharmacodynamic effects of a drug and or to identify any adverse reactions to that drug or to study the absorption, distribution, metabolism and excretion of the drug with the object of ascertaining its safety and efficacy. So as alluded to earlier, there are 13 principles of GCP, and I'm going to go through each one and pull out the relevant things that can be done throughout GCP to support that. So Principle 1 is clinical trials should be conducted in accordance with the ethical principles that have their origin in the Declaration of HELSINKI, that are consistent with GCP and the applicable regulatory requirements. So the Declaration of HELSINKI. So following the atrocities revealed by World War II, the 1947 Nuremberg Code had 10 principles which was first tied into the Declaration of Geneva in 1948, which was a statement of physicians' ethical duties. The declaration specifically addressed clinical research, reflecting changes in medical practice from the term human experimentation, used in the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code stated that consent was absolutely essential, and now doctors were being asked to obtain consent where at all possible, and research was only allowed without consent where a proxy was available. So Principle 2. Before a trial is initiated, the foreseeable risks and inconveniences should be weighed against the anticipated benefit for the individual trial subject and society. And a trial should be initiated and continued only if the anticipated benefits justify the risks. Principle 3, the right, safety and well-being of the trial subjects are the most important considerations and should prevail over the interests of science and society. A good historical example of where this was clearly not a consideration was the experimentation revealed from Unit 731 in Japan, which was run by the Imperial Japanese Army during the Second Sino-Japanese War between 1937 and 1945. Unfortunately, instead of being tried for war crimes, researchers involved were provided immunity in exchange for their data. The United States utilised it in their biological warfare programme. So vivisection without anaesthesia, the removal of organs while patients were alive in order to preserve the organs, amputations to study, blood loss, reattachment of limbs to different sites of the body. Some prisoners had their limbs frozen to study the effect of frostbite. Some prisoners were centrifuged to death or starved to death, as in how long did it take. So there is biological warfare experiments, such as the development of symptoms and spread of bubonic plague, cholera, smallpox, botulism, following direct inoculation, and what the most efficient methods were. There were also weaponry and bomb studies, where bombs were detonated at various distances away from the unfortunate victims to facilitate determining the most effective and destructive way to cause harm. Principle 4. The available non-clinical and clinical information on the drug should be adequate to support the proposed clinical trial. So you're not permitted to commence your chosen phase or clinical stage of research without sufficient background evidence or knowledge to support moving into that phase. So to support that information, you have the Investigator brochure. It's a compilation of clinical and non-clinical data on the drug that is relevant to the study of the product in human subjects. Chapter 7 of the ICH GCP guidelines actually gives you structure of what an investigator brochure should contain. So it's well worth looking at. It should be reviewed and updated annually, and the principal investigator should ensure that all the study team members are updated and familiar with the new information, and that training should be recorded on the training log, which is kept in the trial master file. You should ensure that all participating sites receive the updated information, especially any participating pharmacy departments. And where a review of an investigator brochure is conducted and no changes are required, that should be documented and filed in the trial master file just to prove that it has actually been reviewed. Principle 5, clinical trials should be scientifically sound and described in a clear and detailed protocol. So you've got the protocol definition there, a document that describes the objectives, design, methodology, statistical considerations, and organisation of a trial. The protocol usually also gives the background and rationale for the trial, but these could be provided in other protocol reference documents. And again, in ICH GCP Chapter 6, the contents of the protocol are described in Chapter 6. So Principle 6, a trial should be conducted in compliance with that protocol that has received prior Review Board Ethics Committee approval. Principle 7, the medical care given to and medical decisions made on behalf of the subject should always be the responsibility of a qualified physician or, where appropriate, of a qualified dentist. With Principle 8, each individual in conducting a trial should be qualified by education, training and experience to perform his or her respective tasks. The investigator responsibilities, there is revision 2 additions. Supervision of any individual party to whom there have been delegated trial-related duties and functions at site. So this is where the investigator must ensure that he has appropriately delegated duties within the trial to his team members. Should ensure that this individual party is qualified to perform those trial-related duties and functions and implement procedures to ensure that the integrity of the trial-related duties and functions performed and any other data is generated. You should maintain adequate and accurate source documents and trial records that include all pertinent observations on each of the SART's trial subjects. You should make sure it's legible so that it can actually be used as your source data when the monitor comes in, or any investigators or inspection bodies. So, in short, the investigator must ensure that he has appropriate oversight of any of the delegated duties that he's given to the appropriately trained staff. So who is the chief investigator? It's the person that's designated as taking overall responsibility. So it's the overall lead of a clinical trial for a multi-site study. So who is the principal investigator? It's the person at each site who is basically the team leader. And it may be that if it's a single centre study, he may be the chief investigator as well. So which of the following are GCP responsibilities of the investigator? All of them? So it's the responsibility of the investigator to make sure that the study participants are compensated. It's the responsibility of the investigator to make sure that communication with participant family members is upheld. I would say, and hopefully you will agree, that it's 1, 3, and 5. Agreed? Perfect. The role of the Research Ethics Committee. So the Research Ethics Committee have all the documents on the checklists that they have to go through. They have the protocol to critique and review and to assess, to ensure that the project is sound. They need to ensure that there's been peer review of that project, to ensure that the hypothesis is supported. They will also be looking at the CVs to ensure that the PI certainly is suitably qualified, that any risks have been identified in the protocol and that they've been suitably mitigated. They'll be looking at the patient information sheet to ensure that the patients are fully aware of the potential risks and benefits, which is why they'll often want the investigator brochure or the summary of product characteristics of the drug, if it's licensed, to be submitted as well. Make sure that you are telling the patient everything that could possibly go wrong. So in the protocol, you would need to also describe how the risks to the participants will be managed, and that the consent form and the patient information sheet will also describe how the risks are going to be managed for that patient and what the likelihood of those risks are occurring, and to make sure that there are no inducements that are being used to persuade the patients to actually go on to the study, so no coercions. So from the Research Ethics Committee, what do they not need to see? Agreed? Normally, the compensation for insurance purposes would normally be described in the patient information sheet, because if anything does go wrong, the patients need to know whether or not they're going to be covered and how they can go about gaining access to that cover. So I'd say it's a study management plan. Agreed? Yep. Perfect. Principle 9. Freely given informed consent should be obtained from every subject prior to clinical trial participation. So informed consent is a process by which a participant voluntarily confirms his or her willingness to participate in a particular trial, after having been informed of all aspects of a trial that are relevant to his decision to participate. Informed consent is documented by means of a written, signed and dated consent form. It must be obtained before any research-related activity occurs. A copy of the consent form, the signed consent form, and the patient information sheet should be given to the participant. A copy should be retained in the investigator site file of the signed consent form, and the original should go in the medical notes. However, a caveat to that is a lot of hospitals, specifically in the UK, for example, and I'm sure across Europe, are moving to electronic patient records. So if that is the case, I would retain the original signed consent form in your site files and have a copy placed in the electronic patient records.
Yeah, but there is also the principle of e-consent. Heard about that? The patient gets the information on the tablet and can read through it, and everything is explained. And then the patient signs on the tablet e-signature. And is this also accepted, or do you have to print it out?
That is acceptable in this age of electronic, in this age. And this is, I think, partly the reason why the GCP guidelines were actually modernised to do with this electronic record. But that would have to be approved by the review board, your ethics committee. So they would have to be happy with that. You would also, considering inspection by the competent authorities, be able to provide an audit trail and be able to, I suppose, demonstrate that that was the actual patient that signed it. And it's a continuous process throughout the study. So withdrawal of consent also has to be described in your protocol, and it would have to be described in your patient information sheet as to what withdrawal of consent would possibly mean to anything that was collected up to that point. So you may actually have to ask permission of the participant if the data or samples, for example, collected up to that point had not been anonymised, whether or not you can still use them in your analysis. The participant should also be aware and made aware and reminded that it is their right to withdraw at any time during the study, and that their onward medical care would not be affected. So requirements for valid consent. So who can obtain a consent? So it should be the chief investigator, the principal investigator, or a suitably qualified individual. That suitably qualified individual must be somebody that can describe any of the alternative treatments or care paths. So they must be quite knowledgeable in the care or the potential care of that participant. They must ensure that there is sufficient opportunity to read and consider the information, and obviously the time given is preferably over 24 hours, and any time shorter than that should be justified by the participant, for example, stating that there is no way that they would possibly change their mind. It would also, for really short consents, it would have to have been approved, described and approved by the ethics committee as to the reasoning why. You also have to consider the capacity. So the person that's taking the consent should also consider the participant's age, their maturity in their cognitive ability. In the case of illiterate people, you should consider the use perhaps of a thumbprint and a name and date of any witness, and it should be an impartial witness and not a member of the family. So the name and date of the witness should be entered by that witness and signed. So for adults without capacity, so this is mental illness, mental disability and or brain damage, there are country-specific regulations. In Austria, there is a surrogate consent for drug studies only. It should be a legally designated person to give consent for another adult, and there is a hierarchy. The preferred person would be the personal legal representative, so that'll be the next of kin, possibly, or suitable by virtue of relationship, and they should be willing to act on behalf of the participant. If that person isn't available and it's an emergency situation, then a professional legal representative can be used. They should not be connected with the study. They should, however, be primarily responsible for the person's medical care or be nominated by the relevant healthcare provider to be that person. And obviously, in this case, as a person gains capacity, or in the case where the professional legal representative had provided consent, when the next of kin or the personal legal representative turns up, they should be asked. If they refuse, then obviously that patient has to be withdrawn from the study and their data cannot be used. Now, if the next of kin confirms that the patient or the participant can stay in, then that consent should be documented in the medical notes. All stages should be documented, by the way. So that stage should be documented in the medical notes. And when the person gains capacity or becomes conscious, then they should be asked whether or not, or told that they've been included in the study and asked their consent for their continued participation. So for unconscious patients, research should relate directly to a life-threatening condition of a subject. The legal representative, personal or professional, can give consent. A waiver will only be accepted if it's been described and been allowed by the ethics committee. The emergency research should be reconsented at follow-up. So as soon as that person gains consent or the next of kin turns up, again, you go up the hierarchy. And at any point, that participant can be withdrawn. But each stage should be documented. So the assent of minors, only research that directly relates to a child's clinical condition should be conducted. A parent's signature is sufficient in law. It is best practice to get the assent of a child if deemed competent. An assent is not legally binding, however, it is favoured by ethics committees. A child should be involved as much as possible, and use of age-related information sheets. So obviously, the younger they get, the more pictures are used and less words. Parental consent should reflect the wishes of a child. However, these may actually overrule the parent's wishes. And where you've got a child that, in this modern age where two parents don't live together, it's always best to get the consent from both parents for inclusion in the study. Otherwise, you might be best advised not to include them in the study, because you could end up in a court of law having to describe why that the parents' wishes that didn't want them included were overruled. So a question. Which of the following is false about the informed consent process? Anything else? Yes! Yep. All agreed? So the second and last point. Brilliant. So, some inspection findings. Missing consent forms. So it was not possible to verify that the subjects had consented. Lack of subject or investigator signature to demonstrate that a conversation and agreement had actually taken place to participate. Unapproved consent forms used. Consent form used referencing the wrong patient information sheet. And consent taken by persons not listed on the delegation log. Therefore, no evidence of training to obtain consent. So on that point, I would say, remember to keep your approved document list up to date. If you spot a document that requires amendment, make sure that you seek approval from the appropriate authorities first before you use it. Keep your team training logs up to date and think ahead to scenarios to cover annual leave and/or sickness. So make sure you don't keep your teams too small, because otherwise you could end up in hot water. So I've got some examples, or an example of a patient information sheet and a consent form that we made up, but I want you to have a look at and just see sort of what can possibly go wrong. Anything glaringly obvious that leaps out at you?
Do I have to take part in the section?
Right, happy for me to continue? Yeah. Perfect. Principle 10. So, all clinical trial information should be recorded, handled and stored in a way that allows its accurate reporting, interpretation and verification. So we all have that familiar look at the person that's come in, sort of like with your trial documentation. You just about can't see them over the top of the paperwork. So what are these essential documents? So they're those which are individually and collectively permit the evaluation of the conduct of a trial, the quality of the data, and these documents demonstrate the compliance with GCP and your protocol. Filing of those essential documents is absolutely imperative throughout the life cycle of your study, because otherwise dreadful things could go wrong. Consider if the safety information or safety data hadn't been filed away in your trial master file and you had a possible incident with a patient. So it's the first thing that the inspectors, auditors and monitors look at. It helps organise the paperwork, so it saves time, effort and facilitates the organisation of the study. So a trial master file should be established at the beginning of the trial, both at the investigator site and the sponsor office. The essential documents are generally grouped in 3 stages of the trial, and that's normally where they are generated. So it's at the beginning, prior and during the preparation for submission. It's through the clinical phase of that project and following completion and trial termination. A description and the purpose of each document and whether kept at the sponsor office or the investigator's site file or both is described in ICH GCP section 8.2 to 8.4, and that does actually give you where those documents are generated generally. All documents described should be available for audit by the sponsor's monitor and inspection by the regulatory authorities. And despite the fact that the list is very, very long in ICH GCP, it is by no means exhaustive. So there are some changes brought about by revision 2 of the GCP guidelines. The sponsor and the investigator must maintain the record of location of the documents, including the source documents. So if you haven't got those documents in your files, your site files or your trial master file, then there needs to be a note to say exactly where they are and how they can be referenced or, got at. Storage system used during the trial and for archiving, irrespective of the type of media used, should provide for document identification, version history, search and retrieval. So some of the inspectors that have been going out to sites are all very modernised with the hybrid studies or with the electronic files. However, what they are finding difficult is where the electronic filing system hasn't got a retrieval, so you can't have a search function on it. So just make sure that if you are going to have your files inspected, that there is a way that particular documents can be quickly found. Essential documents should be supplemented or maybe reduced where justified, and you should do that before the study is initiated. Just put a file note in there to say why there isn't a document in that space, and it should be based on the importance and relevance of specific documents within the study. The sponsor should ensure that the investigator has control of and continuous access to the CRF data, and the sponsor should not have exclusive control of that data. So where copies are used to replace an original, the copy must fulfil the requirements of a certified copy. And the certified copy is actually one of the new things that's been added to Chapter 1 glossary. The investigator should have control of all the essential documents and records generated by the investigator before, during and after the trial. So it's no longer the case where the sponsor at the end of a study can come in and just whip everything away for their archives. If they do, they have to make sure that the investigator maintains access and knows how to access the documents whenever he needs to. Principle 11. The confidentiality of records that could identify subjects should be protected, respecting the privacy and confidentiality rules in accordance with the applicable regulatory requirements. So we all have heard about the data protection regulation, which is soon to hit the shores of Europe in May 2018. So the Data Protection Directive was created to regulate the progression of personal data within the EU and is part of the EU privacy and human rights law. So the official text of the new regulation was published in the official journal of the European Union on the 4th of May 2016. And the new rules will become applicable 2 years thereafter. Therefore, on the 25th of May 2018, that's when it all hits us. So it's to harmonise the current data protection laws across the EU member states. And the regulation means it will directly be applicable to all EU member states without the need for national implementing legislation. And if you get a copy of these slides, I've put the link there. So the Investigator site file. This is just a few of the things that should be found in the site file. And you'll note that the participant master file and the consent forms are underlined. They must never be stored in the trial master file because they hold patient identifying information. So any lists, such as screening logs, must also be tagged out. And if they are going to be shared, make sure that they're properly anonymised. The participant will be assigned trial ID numbers, a unique trial ID number, so it keeps that anonymisation throughout the data. So case report forms, they are the property of the sponsor, but the source data should not be a replica of the CRF. The CRF can only be a source document if the data is solely for trial purposes and not routine clinical practice, e.g. repeated vital signs. The CRF data must be consistent with the source documents and any discrepancies must be explained. You should have a written agreement with the sponsor via the clinical trials monitor of what data, if any, can be directly recorded in the CRF, and that will be on a source document memo. And this would be signed off by the PI and the trials monitor, and a copy kept in the site file for future reference. So a quick note on document control. So all documents should have a version number and a date. They should have a standard numbering system, and there should be an approval and distribution procedure, and it should be defined. So that would be one of my biggest things that I always check when I'm looking at documents is, do they have version numbers and dates on them? And obviously when I'm cross-matching all of the ethical approval documentation, I'm cross-matching what I've got against what the ethics committee have actually approved. So quality control, it's the operational techniques and activities undertaken within the quality assurance system to verify that the requirements for quality of a trial related activities have been fulfilled. Monitoring, in other words. It's identifying a problem and implementing a solution. It's continuous during the research, and it's carried out by the people that are actually conducting the work. So the sponsor should utilise appropriately qualified individuals to supervise the overall conduct of a trial, to handle the data, to verify the data, and to conduct the statistical analysis and to prepare the trial reports. So revision 2 additions for quality management. So this is a major addition to ICH GCP. The methods used to assure and control the quality of the trial should be proportionate to the risks inherent in the study and the importance of the information collected. The sponsor should ensure that all aspects of the trial are operationally feasible and should avoid unnecessary complexity, procedures and data collection. Protocols, case report forms and other operational documents should be clear, concise and consistent. So the sponsor team and the investigator should work together throughout the protocol development to discuss and identify risk and delivery of the project. The statistician should have a say on the data collected for analysis, which in turn needs to be agreed both by the sponsor and the CI, Chief Investigator. So the quality management system should use a risk-based approach on critical process and data identification, risk identification, evaluation, control, communication, review, and reporting. So I've got an example. So if bloods are collected on a Friday afternoon, obviously you're going to need a courier to take them to the laboratory. So is there a risk of, if the laboratory is shut over the weekend, of the courier arriving late and your blood's being wasted? So, do you move blood sampling to midweek, or do you change labs? So these are the things that, as a sponsor, you have to weigh up to see sort of like which way you're going to jump. So you've also got to think about the likelihood of that error occurring and how many patients are likely to be affected, to weigh against the cost of having a weekend lab. So risk communication, for example, it could be that the sponsor would need to tell the sites not to collect bloods after 2:30 on a Friday. And from the investigator point of view, perhaps the clinic that he's got on the Friday shouldn't be used for those research participants. So monitoring. The purposes are to verify that the rights and well-being of the subjects are protected, that the reported data is accurate, complete and verifiable from the source documents, that the conduct of a trial is in compliance with the approved protocol, any amendments, GCP and the applicable regulatory requirements. A monitor should be appointed by the sponsor. They should be appropriately trained and qualified. They should be familiar with the protocol, the drug, the patient information, sponsor SOPs, GCP, and of course the applicable regulations. So the monitor is the middleman or the tool of the sponsor. So monitoring, revision 2 additions. Right, so the sponsor should develop a systematic, prioritised, risk-based approach to monitoring clinical trials. The sponsor may choose on-site monitoring, a combination of on-site and centralised monitoring, or where justified, just centralised monitoring. The sponsor should also document the rationale for the chosen monitoring strategy in the monitoring plan. So, for example, centralised monitoring processes, if you were to pick that, generally, sort of like you can identify missing data, inconsistent data and data outliers, unexpected lack of variability and protocol deviations. You can also, from a distance, examine data trends such as the range, consistency and variability of data within and across sites. You can also select sites and or processes for targeted on-site monitoring. On-site and or centralised monitoring should be provided to the sponsor, including appropriate management and staff responsible for the trial on site oversight and a timely manner for review and follow-up. Results of monitoring activities should be documented in sufficient detail to allow verification of compliance with the monitoring plan. Reporting of centralised monitoring activities should be regular and may be independent from site visits. So the sponsor should develop a monitoring plan that is tailored to the specific human subject protection and data integrity risks of the trial. So electronic data, revision 2 additions. When using electronic data handling and or remote electronic trial data systems, the sponsor should base their approach to validation of such systems on a risk assessment. The sponsor should have SOPs for using these systems. The SOPs should cover system setup, installation and use. The responsibilities of the sponsor, investigator and other parties in relation to the use of these systems should be clear and training provided. and should ensure the integrity of the data. And one of the biggest no-nos that I would say would be the sharing of passwords for electronic systems because of the audit trail. So, back to the study. Amendments. So there are two types of amendments. There is substantial, which is an amendment to the protocol or any other supporting documentation that is likely to affect to a significant degree the safety or physical or mental integrity of the trial subjects, scientific value of the trial, conduct or management of the trial. So non-substantial would just require notification, and this would mean just typos, amending members of the research team except CI or the PI. And if they change, it's a substantial amendment. You must retain all of the documents in the investigator site file or the trial master file, and any documents that are no longer approved for use must be clearly marked as superseded, and I suggest adding the date as well, and whoever superseded should add their initials. Pharmacy must be included in the circulation list of approved protocols and updated reference safety information. And remember to update your training log in your site files. So urgent safety measures, these can be implemented immediately for the protection of trial subjects. However, the Research Ethics Committee or the competent authority must be notified within 3 days in writing of what has been implemented. And this normally follows your immediate notification of them via telephone, and the 3-day time period is summarising what that conversation entailed and what was agreed. After that, and you've communicated those urgent safety measures to all of your collaborating PIs and sites, you must start thinking about preparing an amendment. So, inspection findings. Lack of principal investigator oversight, so he had no control over his team. Trial master files provided for inspection were incomplete. Lack of essential documents, for example, drug shipment receipts in pharmacies, blood sample shipments to central labs, incomplete trial subject screening lists, review of eligibility criteria and the decision wasn't documented in the notes, missing source documents, discrepancies between source data and data reported in the clinical study report, lack of evidence of sponsor procedure use, poor document control, documents not superseded or removed from circulation upon update, and illegible source data. So we're getting to the end of the principles. So principle 12, drugs should be manufactured, handled and stored in accordance with applicable good manufacturing practice, and the drug should be used in accordance with the approved protocol. So you do need your pharmacy expertise. All drugs, including the comparator and placebo, should be manufactured in accordance with any applicable GMP, should be coded, labelled in a manner that protects the blinding and in accordance with the applicable regulatory requirements. Decoding unblinding of treatment in case of medical emergency only, so you can use your pharmacy to do that. Obviously, they're the experts on storage temperatures, storage conditions, for example, protect from light, any reconstitution fluids and the procedures, stability and compatibility information, drug accountability and chain of custody details. So they're well versed with the receipt, dispense, reconcile, participants' returns to checks, compliance and reconciliation from site to sponsor, and then obviously at the end, destruction. So you'll get your full chain of custody of your drug. It is the sponsor's responsibility to ensure that all of this information is available. And if you've got a good sponsor, they'll have a pharmacist on board. So the pharmacy site file, this list is by all means not exhaustive, but that is typically what you'll be expecting to find in a PSF. And obviously at the end of the study, this pharmacy site file will form part of the overall investigator site file. So, question. If the temperature of the drug was not recorded for 3 days, according to the protocol, this should have been monitored daily. Who is responsible? Everyone agreed? Totally. It is the investigator's responsibility, unfortunately for him. Principle 13. Systems with procedures that assure the quality of every aspect of a trial should be implemented. So, together with all the other systems and considerations in place, there are still more ways to assure the continued quality of your project, data and the safety of your patients. This was alluded to earlier, where a good study monitor is worth their weight in gold. Regular trial management group meetings should be held to discuss the day-to-day aspects of the project. And obviously, if you do hold regular trial management group meetings, make sure that they're minuted and the notes are kept in your site file. You may also require a data and safety monitoring committee that will receive regular reports and oversee significant events within the study lifetime and advise the sponsor on risk mitigation, or, for example, the next dose level increment for a dose escalation study. So the sponsor is an individual, company, institution or organisation which takes the responsibility for the initiation of a clinical trial. All clinical trials must have a designated sponsor. They must be named in the protocol. It's not necessarily the funder. And for academic studies, it's the chief investigator's employer. The sponsors can delegate responsibilities to the chief investigator. However, there are some revision to responsibility additions for the sponsor. So the sponsor should ensure oversight of any trial-related duty and function carried out on its behalf, which includes trial-related duties and functions that are subcontracted to another party by the sponsor's contracted clinical research organisation. If there is non-compliance that significantly affects or potentially affects human subject protection or reliability of trial results discovered, the sponsor should perform a root cause analysis and implement appropriate corrective and preventative actions. So, compliance with GCP provides a public assurance that the rights, safety and well-being of trial subjects have been protected, is consistent with the principles that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki, and that the clinical trial data is credible. Not finished yet. Safety reporting. So, pharmacovigilance. It's the process and science of monitoring the safety of medicines and taking action to reduce those risks and increase the benefits of the medicines. So what's it all about? So it's to collect and manage the data on safety. It's an interrogation of the data to detect any signals or new or changing issues. It's the evaluation and decision-making with regards to those safety issues. It's proactive risk management to minimise potential risks associated with the drug use. And obviously, you're acting to protect public health and against regulatory action. It's communicating with and informing the stakeholders and obviously the public. So definitions, I'm afraid this bit is really boring and I'm sure that you all do know the definitions. So adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical trial participant administered a medicinal product. It does not need to be related to the drug. And the adverse reaction is related to any dose administered of that medicinal product. In your protocol, it's probably really useful to state when adverse event reporting starts and finishes in relation to dosing, which is what Sven was alluding to earlier. So highly recommend that. Sorry about my formatting. It's any adverse event, so serious adverse events, is any adverse event that results in death, is life-threatening, requires hospitalisation, or if they're already in hospital, sort of like prolong that stay, results in persistent or significant disability or incapacity, is a congenital anomaly or birth defect, or is otherwise considered medically significant by the investigator. So medically significant, what does this mean? So it could be pregnancy or impregnation. So theoretically, pregnancy follow-up may differ depending on the drug pharmacodynamic profile, hence scientific advice may need to be sought, or because of long-term possible effects may not be known at all, so you just follow it up. Lack of efficacy. So this may well have been picked up by the unblinded statistician reviewing the emerging data for presentation at the Data Safety Monitoring Committee. Think about overdose, abuse and misuse, and again this is where your pharmacists could really come in useful, just to make sure that any drugs or any treatments that need to be available on site, on your investigator site, are in stock and readily available in the case that somebody gets rushed in, or even the patient's child or somebody else in the household. So you should make sure that the protocol includes guidance on how that participant's going to be treated. Could it be an expected serious adverse event but an unexpected outcome? An increase in frequency or severity of a serious adverse event, hence regular adverse event log reviews by the investigators for signal detection. So serious adverse reactions. So an adverse reaction that is classed as serious and is consistent with the information about the drug listed in the reference safety information. So i.e. it is expected. And pharmacy may have a vital role, again, in advising on the management or in the provision of medication required for the onward patient management. So SUSARs, getting to the exciting stuff now, is any adverse reaction that is classed as serious and is suspected to be caused by the drug and is not consistent with the information about the drug in the reference safety information. So it's suspected and unexpected. So, as I alluded to earlier, think ahead. In the protocol, list the expected serious adverse events and SARS, both in relation to the known drug side effects and in relation to the disease of the population that you're studying. State which expected adverse events will not be reported or that do not require immediate reporting. But do state when and how, whether or not it's the outcome data or within so many days of the event occurring. Reference the procedures to be followed in the event of a serious adverse event and clearly state who's responsible for carrying those procedures out. So maintain listings of all adverse events and reactions that occur during the study. So the adverse events or reactions that do not need to be reported but may require notification to the sponsor in accordance with the monitoring plan and protocol. And adverse event logs should be regularly clinically reviewed by the CI, the chief investigator, to rule out any trends or increase in frequency or severity, because collectively you could actually pull them together and they could be a serious adverse event. If a data monitoring committee is involved, they could require periodic updates to facilitate ensuring continued participant safety. So there's a causality table. So anything that is definitely, probably, or possibly, or even not accessible those are the things that should be expedited to your competent authority and to the ethics committee. So you have to assess the adverse event for seriousness, causality, and expectedness. If it's serious, suspected, causally related, and not expected, you have to report to the sponsor within 24 hours of first knowledge. Expedited reporting to the competent authority and the Research Ethics Committee, if it's fatal or life-threatening, has to be within 7 days, and then a follow-up within 8 days following. Anything else within 15 days. It has to be reported even if it occurred outside the member state, and you follow it up until resolution. And you include it in the developmental safety update report. And one thing that I have seen, being a sponsor representative myself, is where the reporting is delayed from sites because they don't have what they feel a completed form. We don't care as recipients of these because we need to make sure that the competent authority and the REC are informed within their timelines. So even if you haven't got all of the information, it needs to be forwarded on to your sponsor, because we'll always request follow-up information, and you've got that time and you've ticked the box. So common inspection findings. So failure to report SUSARs, failure to follow up pregnancy outcomes, subject confidentiality, so there have been serious adverse event reports in the trial master files which have contained subject identifiers, failure to submit developmental safety update in a timely fashion, inadequate instructional procedure contained in the protocol to ensure adverse events are recorded or reported appropriately, causality assessment disparity between the PI and CI, so there's no evidence of agreement to changes, because obviously you're always going to go with the worst case scenario, but because you can down-regulate rather than up-regulate. But you need to document the disparity. Lack of sponsor oversight and process to ensure and monitor compliance of SUSAR reporting and developmental safety update report submissions. So there was no reminders being sent to the investigators to make sure that they'd been done. Reference safety information was not clearly defined, and all versions of the monographs used for expectedness were not recorded. So where you are doing a causality assessment and you are using the reference safety information, please document what documents you are using and the versions of those that you've referenced. So a quick note on developmental safety update reports. They replaced the annual safety reports. So it's normally on the anniversary of the first international birthday of competent authority approval. Paediatric studies may require 6 monthly reports. If you're listing multiple studies, then include each study until the declaration of end of that study, even if the end of study falls within a reporting period. You have to still submit the DSIR for it. DSIR per drug to the competent authority, although for some investigator-led studies, the competent authority may accept the report on the anniversary of the competent authority approval. Aggregate reporting. You must ensure that all SAEs and SUSARs for that reporting period are line listed and tabulated in the suggested format. And check for any new information and publications during that reporting period and any updates on drug monographs if you're using licensed medicines. And at that stage, you're actually going to need to assess the risk for your patient population and see whether or not this means by an update in your DSIR, whether or not you're going to have to update your patient information sheet and then reconsent your patients because of the change in risk. So there are other reports that are required for studies. You've got progress reports, declaration of end of study, and the final report. So the annual progress reports have to go to your Research Ethics Committee, and they are normally a condition of the approval. So if they don't receive them, they have the right to withdraw approval for your study. And once your study's not got ethical approval, then theoretically your sponsor approval has also been revoked. It has to be within 30 days of the anniversary of the REC approval until the end of study is declared. So your declaration of end of study needs to be submitted to both your REC and the competent authority. The appropriate form needs to be completed within 90 days of that end of study, or if you've terminated early, within 15 days of that date. The final report on the research study needs to be submitted to your Research Ethics Committee within 12 months. And for your competent authority, what they tend to need is proof for a CTIMP, for a drug study, for example, that your study final report has actually been uploaded onto the UDRA-CT database. And it's no mean feat, I've tried. It needs a statistician to do it, I think. And it needs to be done within 12 months of the end of the study. So the end of study. So archiving. So it's the sponsor and the CI, the chief investigator, who instigate the archiving. And it's all the essential documents that are in the trial master file. It's normally following when the end of study report has been filed. You have to follow, sort of like, hopefully you'll have an archive study procedure. And the sponsor and site files need to be archived separately, so not in the same box. They need to be stored in a secure and environmentally controlled area and retained for a minimum of 5 years for non-drug studies and 15 years for drug studies after study end. However, there is a caveat. If the trial has got data that was used for a license purpose, then you cannot archive until 2 years post last marketing approval within an ICH region. So, quick on the EU directives and new EU regulations. So it's been quite busy, sort of like in the early 2000s. So in 1996, obviously, you had the ICH GCP guidance come in, the first version. The GMP directive was initiated on 8th of October 2003. You then had the European Clinical Trials Directive, 1st of May 2004. GCP directive on 8th of April 2005. And then it brings us right up to date into the near future. You've got the General Data Protection Regulation, which is due 25th of May 2018. And the EU Clinical Trials Regulation, which unfortunately the goalposts keep moving, but it is now planned for October 2019. So a quick few words, a few slides, we're nearly there, on the Clinical Trials Directive and what it was supposed to do. So its goal was to simplify and standardise clinical trials applications for both commercial and academic sponsors across the EU. It was to protect the safety and well-being of participants and improve quality of emerging data. So for the academic studies, what that meant for the warfarin versus aspirin studies of the then times, they had to produce a plethora of documents in the same vein as what a commercial sponsor would have done for a new product. So there was heavily increased document burden for academic partners, an increased financial burden for the academics and the host institutions acting as sponsor, and one size fits all? Well, it didn't. So it caused chaos and caused drastic reduction in academic studies that were being put through. So the European Forum of Good Clinical Practice compared data between 2003 and 2007. And there you can see sort of like the studies being conducted decreased by a quarter. So the EURTC, new trials fell by 63% between 2004 and 2005. And the European, there was a paper which was called The Future of Investigator-Initiated Trials in the EU Academia, Basic Clinical Pharmacology Toxicology in 2007, which gave these. So academic clinical trials fell by 75% in Finland, 70% in Ireland, 25% in Sweden, and 66% in Austria. So why? So each member state interpretation for the directive still led to the need for country-specific document requirements, thus increasing the administrative burden for multinational studies. So Europe became increasingly less attractive for pharma. So the EU clinical trials regulation comes trumping through. So the regulation removes the interpretation and introduces true uniformity. So some highlights. It will not apply to non-interventional studies. And a clinical study is an investigation in relation to humans which is intended to discover or verify the clinical, pharmacological or other pharmacodynamic effects of one or more drugs, to identify any adverse reactions, or to study the absorption, distribution, metabolism and excretion of a drug with the objective of ascertaining safety and efficacy. So what is covered? So clinical trials. So it's the assignment of a subject to a particular therapeutic strategy decided in advance and does not fall within normal clinical practice in the member state concerned. It is the decision to prescribe the drug taken together with the decision to include the subject in the study. It is the diagnostic or monitoring procedures in addition to normal clinical practice as applied to the subjects. And this would be an interventional study, and so it is a clinical trial. And in blue is the non-interventional studies, which would not be covered by the new regulation. So there is a low interventional study, which is defined. So it's drugs which are excluding placebos, which are authorised according to the protocol of a clinical trial, and the drug is used in accordance with the terms of the marketing authorisation, or sort of like it's evidence-based and published by scientific evidence on the safety and efficacy of those drugs in any member state concerned. It's the additional diagnostic or monitoring procedures which do not pose more than minimal additional risk or burden to the safety of subjects compared to normal practice in any member state. So in the UK, the MHRA are already using this risk adaptive approach, and their risk adaptive approach has actually been, adopted into the regulation. So I just thought I'd put it up here so that you can see what this actually means. So we've got 3 types of studies in the UK. So it's the routine prescribing on licensed drugs or the established off-license or off-label use, supported by published evidence. You've then got the type B, so you're looking at a licensed drug which with a new indication or different dose or route of administration, or combinations in which interactions are suspected. And obviously you've got the type C, which is your classic unlicensed drug in any European member state. So I don't think we're going to see much change with regards to submission. So it's going to be a 2-part application, and much the same as what actually gets submitted now. So you've got the scientific part 1, which I can't see any difference there. And you've got the part 2, which is your ethics application. That will be country specific, which would describe what generally is submitted to the ethics and review boards these days anyway. However, there are going to be a plethora of notifications that the sponsor and/or investigator are going to have to provide to the European portal. So it's recruitment start. So when did it actually start? So when did the first poster or patient information sheet get put up or given out? Your first patient, first visit, end of recruitment, last patient, last visit, your final end of trial, so that is last patient, last visit, last country. Any suspensions, temporary halts, early terminations, obviously SUSARs, to the EMA via the Vigilance database, any annual safety reports, and the EMA will forward the reports to the member state, and third country inspection reports. And any of these time points have to be notified to the portal within 15 days. So headline trial management changes. So there's clarification on the use of data obtained based on informed consent following withdrawal of that consent. All previous trial data that's in the submission must be registered on a database, e.g. UDRA-CT or clinicaltrials.gov. Public access to the European Clinical Trials database. Results must be available in lay summary, and the participants must be told how to find results. So that's going to be something that your review boards and your ethics committee are going to want described. Any serious breaches have to be reported within 7 calendar days. Urgent safety measures. The timeline is currently 3 days, so that's increased to 7 days. And the trial master file, so consider this for cost implications, has to be archived for 25 years minimum. So implementation, the timetable is dependent on the European submission portal setup. Planned mid-2019. There will be a transition period, as there often is for these things. And that's it. I have to tell you that Sven has asked that anybody that's here for tomorrow's meeting in the morning, if you can come here at 8:55. Yeah. Any questions? Don't worry about your email address because I will get that from Lee. Thank you for listening and thank you for not snoring.